In the ruthless, perfectly calculated math of nature, your grandmother should not exist. If you look at the animal kingdom, the rules of survival are brutal and strictly enforced. The moment a female animal stops being able to reproduce, she basically stops existing as far as evolution is concerned. No more babies means no more genes to pass on. And if you aren't passing on genes, you are just a drain on resources. You are eating food that a younger, breeding animal needs. So, nature deletes you. A female elephant, a female lion, a female literally almost anything, when her fertility permanently clocks out, her life tends to end pretty soon after. That is the deal. That has always been the deal for millions of years. Except for you. Except for killer whales. And except for a couple of highly specific species of toothed whales, like belugas and narwhals. That is the entire guest list. Elephants do not get this. Lions do not get this. Chimpanzees, your closest living relatives on the entire planet, sharing nearly 99% of your DNA, definitely do not get this. Out of the millions of complex species currently breathing on this planet, only a tiny exclusive handful of animals get decades of life after their reproductive system shuts down, and humans top that list by a mile. A woman today can easily spend a third of her entire life, sometimes almost half of it, living in a body that has biologically finished the making more humans part of its job description. So we are left with a massive biological mystery. Either evolution made a colossal clerical error that somehow survived millions of years of brutal editing, or grandma is doing something so incredibly valuable to the survival of our species that we are not immediately seeing it. Spoiler alert, it is the second one. Meet the grandmother hypothesis. It was first floated by an ecologist named George Williams back in 1957, but it was dramatically leveled up in the 1990s by a brilliant anthropologist named Kristen Hawkes. Hawkes did not just sit in a university armchair and theorize about this. She packed up and went to live with the Hadza, a traditional hunter-gatherer community in Tanzania. She wanted to watch what actually happened day to day, when human beings lived completely off the land, similar to how our ancient ancestors did. What she found broke the old evolutionary story wide open. The Hadza grandmothers were out there, absolutely grinding. They were digging up deep, hidden tubers with heavy wooden digging sticks for hours on end. They were doing this in dry, cracked, unforgiving earth under a blazing sun that would make a younger, fitter person quit by lunch. They were hauling heavy bundles of firewood. They were constantly feeding grandkids who had just been weaned off their mother's milk but couldn't fully forage or feed themselves yet. And they weren't just doing this occasionally. They were doing it constantly. Hawkes and her team actually measured and clocked their work rate against everyone else in the camp. By several metric measures, the oldest women in the community were putting in more active foraging hours than anyone else. These older women were doing some of the hardest physical labor in the entire tribe, well into their twilight years. And every single calorie of that hard-earned food was bypassing their own mouths and going straight into keeping their vulnerable grandchildren alive. Now here is the part that actually explains the biological mystery of menopause, and it goes way beyond just acknowledging grandma's legendary work ethic. In almost all other primates, a mother is trapped by a biological bottleneck. She physically cannot have her next baby until her current baby can confidently feed and defend itself. Chimpanzee moms, for example, will wait 5, sometimes 6 long years between births. Why? Because a chimp mom is a one-woman childcare operation running with absolutely zero backup. She has to drag one increasingly heavy, demanding juvenile around the jungle while actively nursing it the entire time. There is no helpful aunt swinging by with jungle snacks. There is no chimp grandma on standby to babysit. It is just her, totally alone, for half a decade per kid. But humans broke that bottleneck. If a human grandmother is around, she completely covers that awkward, "I can't quite feed myself yet" gap for the toddler. And because grandma takes over the heavy lifting of feeding the older child, mom is suddenly metabolically and physically free to get pregnant again much sooner. The next baby arrives faster. And then the next one. Human birth intervals can run nearly half as long as a chimpanzee's. Humans can mathematically stack dependent children on top of each other in a way that basically no other primate on Earth can manage. And grandmothers are the structural foundation keeping that entire stack from collapsing. Which means, from evolution's cold, ruthless accounting perspective, an older woman who stops having her own babies and instead pours everything into her grandchildren can actually end up producing more surviving descendants than if she kept trying to squeeze out one more high-risk baby on a body running out of road. Menopause is not a biological shutdown. It is a career change. And evolutionarily speaking, it is a massive promotion. Hawkes and her collaborators didn't just leave this as a nice, heartwarming theory. They ran massive computer simulations. They essentially built a fake, evolving human population in a computer and watched what happened to the math over tens of thousands of generations. Populations that randomly developed a grandmothering trait quickly evolved much longer lifespans and dominated. Populations without it collapsed or stagnated. The brutal math perfectly backed up the fieldwork. But hold on. Because there is a twist to this story, and it is a slightly less wholesome one. Some researchers looked at this whole helpful, selfless grandma story and raised a very cynical question. Sure, grandma is helping. But what if grandma isn't just being generous? What if she is also actively getting out of the way before someone aggressively forces her out? This is known as the reproductive conflict hypothesis. It is basically the evolutionary version of 2 generations of women finding out they cannot share the same kitchen without starting a war. In many ancestral human societies, women typically moved away from their own families to live with their new husband's family. That means a mother-in-law and a daughter-in-law often ended up living in the exact same household. And if they were both fertile, they were trying to raise screaming, needy babies at the exact same time, actively competing for the exact same limited pile of food and resources. If you have ever seen 2 women argue intensely at a family gathering about the correct way to swaddle a baby or feed a toddler, congratulations. You have just witnessed a faint modern low-stakes echo of actual life or death evolutionary pressure. Researchers wanted to prove this, so they dug through centuries of ancient Finnish church records. Why Finland? Because Finnish parish registers kept incredibly meticulous, undeniable data on births, deaths, and household addresses going back for generations. The numbers they found were absolutely brutal. When a mother-in-law and a daughter-in-law had babies within 2 years of each other in the same house, infant survival rates plummeted. The older woman's baby saw a 50% drop in survival. And the younger woman's baby? A staggering 66% drop in survival. 2 women. Same household. Same resources. Same year. But radically different odds of keeping their children alive, depending on how the cold math of genetics worked out. Here is the dark logic behind it. A mother-in-law is genetically related to her daughter-in-law's children. Those are her grandkids. But a daughter-in-law shares absolutely 0 DNA with her mother-in-law's new baby. So when push comes to shove, and the winter gets incredibly cold, and the food runs out, whose baby is worth fighting for? Evolution does not care about seniority, and it does not care about respect for your elders. Evolution only cares about genes. And in that specific brutal household fight, older women were biologically built to lose. Menopause, in this darker telling of the story, isn't just a selfless gift to the family. It is a highly calculated, strategic retreat from a biological competition that grandma was destined to lose anyway. So which theory is right? Is it selfless grandmothering, or is it evolutionary conflict avoidance? Here is the twist behind the twist. They are not actually competing theories at all. They are just describing the exact same brilliant strategy from 2 different angles. Get out of a brutal fight you cannot possibly win, and redirect all of your energy into a job, you are perfectly positioned to win instead. Both things can absolutely be true on the same Tuesday. And this is where the story gets genuinely strange, because it turns out humans did not actually invent menopause. We just perfected the marketing. Killer whales do it too, and their version of family dynamics is basically a nature documentary crossed with a mob family. Female orcas can live deep into their 90s, but they entirely stop reproducing in their 30s or 40s. They spend decades as post-reproductive, massive matriarchs ruling the ocean. That is roughly half of a whale's entire lifetime spent not reproducing, which, as we established earlier, should be an absolute death sentence in the wild. Instead, researchers studying orca pods off the Pacific Northwest coast found something incredible. These grandmother orcas literally lead their families to hidden salmon grounds during the toughest, leanest years. When the fish are scarce and the younger whales are panicking, the grandmother uses decades of accumulated deep memory that the younger whales simply do not possess yet. She knows exactly where the fish were hiding during the horrible drought 30 years ago. She remembers the map. If you lose the grandmother, the entire pod's survival odds take a massive hit, especially for the adult grandsons, who apparently rely on her the absolute most. But orcas also perfectly back up the darker, less flattering half of the theory, right on schedule. When researchers checked the breeding data, orca mothers who stubbornly kept trying to breed at the exact same time as their own adult daughters saw their new calves die, at nearly double the normal rate. Same exact household conflict, same exact brutal math, same resource competition. It's just happening underwater, and with significantly more teeth involved. And in 2023, one more massive study threw a curveball that nobody in the scientific community was expecting. Female orcas were found to be acting as literal security details for their adult sons. Scientists studied high-resolution photographs of the whale's skin, counting the literal tooth rake scars left behind from violent underwater fights. They found that adult male orcas who had a living, non-breeding mother swimming close by had over a third fewer battle scars than sons without a mother. She isn't raising them anymore. She isn't feeding them milk. She is just showing up, swimming next to them, and intimidating rival males. Grandma, it turns out, is also a highly effective bouncer. Meanwhile, back over on land, your closest living relatives are quietly proving exactly how rare and precious this whole biological arrangement actually is. Chimpanzees, gorillas, orangutans, none of them reliably live long past their fertile years the way you do. Most wild female chimps are still actively cycling, still desperately trying for one more baby, right up until the exact day they die of old age. Now, a specific wild chimp community in Uganda, called Ngogo, was very recently documented showing some signs of menopause too. That discovery was startling enough to make researchers completely rewrite their textbooks, because it had never been firmly confirmed in a wild ape population before. But even in that one specific jungle, it is the rare exception, not the rule. And more importantly, those post-reproductive female chimps mostly just don't stick around their daughters to help. Female chimps typically leave their home turf for good once they are fully grown, scattering to completely different communities, which means there is no shared kitchen, there is no mother-in-law conflict, and there is absolutely no grandmothering payoff waiting on the other side. It is just proof that the biological hardware for menopause can technically appear in a species without evolution ever actually figuring out how to cash in on it. And that is the real punchline here. Menopause purely by itself isn't the interesting part. Plenty of weird biological quirks could theoretically happen and just never get used. What is actually interesting is what a species decides to do with it once it exists. Orcas turned it into decades of salmon-finding leadership and unofficial bodyguard duty. A few chimps apparently just let it sit there, totally unused, biologically capable, but socially pointless. But somewhere along the way, your ancient ancestors took that exact same biological quirk and turned it into an absolute superpower. They turned it into the engine that allowed human families to stack multiple dependent children at once. It allowed us to hand down decades of accumulated survival knowledge. It allowed us to build the kind of deep, rich, multi-generational support system that absolutely no other primate on Earth even attempts. Think about everything that silent engine quietly makes possible today. Grandparents patiently teaching skills that exhausted parents simply do not have the time to teach. Households where 3 entirely different generations pool their labor and their incomes, instead of one chronically exhausted person trying to do it all alone. There is a 2-million-year-old evolutionary survival strategy running smoothly in the background every single time a grandmother happily picks up a crying baby just so a mother can sleep, or take a hot shower, or just exist as a human being for 10 uninterrupted minutes. None of that massive leap forward required new genes. It didn't require the invention of stone tools, and it didn't require the discovery of fire. It just required evolution to slowly realize that a woman past childbearing age wasn't finished. She was just getting reassigned to upper management. So the next time you see your grandmother stubbornly digging through her garden, or showing up completely uninvited with 3 heavy casserole dishes that nobody asked for, or aggressively repeating the exact same story about a boy she almost married in 1962, take a second to remember what you are actually looking at. That is not just your family. That is one of evolution's rarest, most successful, and most exclusive biological experiments. And it is running live, right there in your kitchen. And it is still working.